It's very good to be here. I'm going to be talking, as Marta said, about models of government, models of public management reform, and what is the best model of, or the most viable model of public management reform in an age of digital technology, particularly the internet and the web, and also what model is the most viable in a period of economic crisis, which is what your country, any of your countries, my country, are facing at the moment. So, first of all, I will talk about two models, one of which is digital era governance, as has been labelled by myself and colleagues at the London School of Economics, as a model of government which puts digital technology at the centre of governmental reform. Then also about new public management, a model of government which was really the dominant model of reform for many countries, particularly the UK, the US, Australasia, and many other countries during the 1980s and 90s. And is still, I'm going to argue, a model of government that that political leaders are going to look to as a possibility, particularly in an age of austerity, something that's been much advertised as having the possibility to save money. What's the status of these models at the moment? How have they been developing over the past years, and how will they develop into the future? How will these two models of government fare in a time of austerity and cutback? Okay, so what are these two models? Let me elucidate a little. Basically, what I'm going to say draws on what was laid out in this book, Digital Era Governance, IT Corporations, the State and E-Government, written by myself, Patrick Dunleavy from the London School of Economics, and other colleagues. And in that book, we, first of all, described what has now been labelled by which there is scholarly consensus, has been labelled new public management, the dominant model of the 1980s. That was a model of government which emphasised the idea of government as business, of breaking government agencies and breaking up government departments into agencies, and micro-local agencies. Disaggregation was a key theme of new public management. Injecting competition into governmental organisations where there hadn't been competition before, creating quasi-markets, for example, and incentivisation, incentivising governmental organisations and government officials to behave as they might behave in a private sector context, performance-related pay and so on. In that book, we argued, perhaps some people have since said prematurely, that new public management was dead, that intellectually and as a viable model for contemporary government, it was dead. The new public management agenda was over. That's not to say that these themes are not still being used in many countries, are not still on the table, but we argued that they're not kind of growing as themes of public management reform. Instead, we argued for a new model of government, digital era governance, which places digital technologies, the internet and the web, at the centre of public management reform. In contrast to new public management, digital era governance rests on the themes of reintegration, of removing some of the fragmentation of the new public management years. Needs-based holism, by which we mean reorganising government around the needs of citizens rather than the needs of governmental organisation. And digitalisation, capitalising upon the possible benefits of digital technologies, placing them at the centre, and taking advantage of what people are doing with technology, and in particular the social web and newer so-called Web 2.0 technologies. the key difference, I guess, between those two models, we're not being technologically deterministic when we laid out the digital era governance agenda. Not all these changes are based on technology. They're organizational and social as much as they are technological. But certainly it is a key distinction between these two models. Although people who wrote about new public management and advocated new public management occasionally talked or about information technology and the technologies of the time as being a way to achieve that, there was very little intellectually that fitted into the new public management agenda that had to do with technology. It was more a little bit of dressing, a little bit of sauce, if you like, on a rather different agenda. So I would point to that as a key difference between them. So, since that time, however, even, I guess, a few years ago, I was in Japan, which was always regarded as a country which hadn't really taken up the new public management agenda. In Japan in the early 2000s, I think I was there in 2003, there was a big push towards new public management even at that time. Just to illustrate the fact that it hasn't gone away, that it hasn't, it's still a sort of model on the table, even if we've argued it's dead. And if you looked on a bookshelves in the politics section of a Japanese bookshop at that time, you would see lots of Japanese script with NPM in the middle. And I think particularly given its kind of its fit with a more ideological agenda of governments to the right, we might definitely see, if we were going to see a revival, we might expect to see it now in a time of economic crisis, where many countries in Europe are facing, countries and nations in Europe are anticipating political change. In the UK, we have seen a new government come to power where virtually none of the ministers in the current government have been ministers before. We certainly have the possibility of seeing some sort of NPM policies kind of dusted down and revived for an age of austerity. So it's definitely to think, it definitely makes sense at this moment to think about where new public management has been these last few years and where it might go. I don't expect you to sort of take in all this text in detail. What I merely mean to do here is to lay out the sort of elements, the micro elements, the foundations of new public management, and to then of digital era governance, and to look for the little triangles. Are they going up or are they going down? And we would argue that in general, most of the elements of new public management over the last few years have been going down. Well, that's what the little triangles mean. For example, agentsification, the project of breaking down large departments into small agencies, a policy which had a small country like New Zealand. I don't think there's anybody from New Zealand here. I don't want to be rude about New Zealand, but it is about the size of Birmingham, you know, or a large city in many other countries. And at the height of the new public management agenda, actually had 300 agencies at central government level. This is completely crazy and also fantastically expensive, basically. So agentsification is both something that is not being pursued enthusiastically across OECD countries. The little A in brackets is not a sort of report card or exam mark. What I mean here is to consider the possibility whether this particular element of reform would be enhanced or constrained by austerity. That's the idea of the A minus here. And I think agentsification, corporatization, the sort of developing a kind of business model for government agencies and departments, expensive, something that governments facing austerity are not necessarily going to think about. Quasi-governmental agencies, in the UK, for example, we've just had the announcement that 170 quasi-governmental agencies are going to be are destined for the scrap heap. That's something which looks expensive in an age of austerity. So agencyfication, I would argue, on the way down. The only sort of element of this theme of new public management that we might expect to be going up in an age of authority is the creation of micro local agencies. In the UK, the current buzzwords are the big society, which opinions vary on what the big society means. In fact, I don't think anybody quite knows what the big society means. But one of the things it definitely seems to mean is sort of central government disengagement, load shedding to the local level, voluntary agencies. That is definitely part of the big society. And we might see not quasi-governmental agencies at the central level or the regulatory level, but agencies sort of on the ground. We might see a revival of that in an age of austerity. Moving on to the next new public management theme, that of competition. You're seeing a number of things in this middle column here, which are, although I would argue not sort of growing or expanded and not likely to be boosted dramatically in an age of austerity, but have been routinized as kind of options for public agencies looking for strategies for public management. So outsourcing, market testing, contracting, all things which are considered as viable options for public agencies, but not necessarily as a sort of mandatory option, at least not as far as actually sort of whole-scale outsourcing or total sourcing, as it's being called. Quasi-markets, something which was pursued with particular fervour in the United Kingdom during the 1980s, is being talked about for the National Health Service again, although the estimate of some experts that it would cost more than £2 billion to implement in the form that's being suggested might cause such a plan to fail in an age of austerity. Voucher schemes, something else that goes under the competition label, is definitely proved to be expensive and are not being talked about in the UK or in the US or other MPM countries. The idea of consumer tagged financing, however, of budgets that are designed around the consumer are something that we are hearing talked about and is on the table. When people realize how expensive it is, it's likely to go down again. That's why it gets an A-. The third new public management theme, incentivization. Again, several elements here which have been, sorry, I should be pointing over there. Several elements here which have become sort of routinized into public management reform. Such as the privatization of asset ownership, charging technologies, performance-related pay. But performance-related pay we might expect to see rather unpopular in an age where a lot of public officials are being asked to take pay cuts, not likely to be part of the public management agenda at the moment. Several things going down here. Light touch regulation, for example, didn't come out very well of the credit crisis. And is unlikely to be pursued with great enthusiasm. The Private Finance Initiative, a major programme of whole-scale outsourcing in the UK, where which proved a miserable failure in terms of private sector companies taking on governmental risk, which is what it was intended to do. Again, not likely to be revisited in a period of crisis. The idea of mandatory efficiency dividends, however, is something which was promoted as part of the new public management agenda, and we are likely to see government departments doing that again, certainly in the UK, although some departments, such as the health service, have been ring-fenced. All other departments are being asked to take 25%, even 40% cuts in the coming years. Quite how that's to be achieved is very uncertain, but certain departments are being mandated to undergo a period of review and then to come up with plans for a set percentage of cuts. And that's something we also saw during the MPM years. Okay, so much for new public management. A lot of elements, some of them routinized, a lot of them already becoming unpopular before the financial crisis hit. Some of them may get revived, but in general, I would argue a range of elements that are not or would find it hard to be justified in an era of austerity. So what about digital era governance? Digital era governance is not a U-turn on new public management. It's not it's not a 180-degree turn, more like more like a tack. Imagine government like a sailing boat going up the modernisation river. We like river analogies in Oxford because we live on a sort of bit of muddy ground in between two rivers, and hit by crisis. I mean, I think even before the financial crisis, there were many senses in which new public management was hitting crisis levels, particularly things like the private finance initiative, agencyfication in countries where it was pursued most radically. Digital era governance would be a turn away from that. What I want to put forward to you is that with the advent of the social web and newer technologies, there is the possibility for a second wave of digital era governance, which moves a little bit further away from the new public management agenda and really capitalizes on what people are doing, what ordinary people are doing with the web these days. Okay, so what would that look like if that's the case, and how has digital era governance been progressing in the past few years? In the book Digital Era Governance, we argued that within the theme of reintegration, we were seeing a range of elements being discussed and being put forward by OECD governments. One of them was joined-up governance, which was a kind of theme of the late 1990s, particularly in the UK, so that it came to have its own acronym. That's a sign of success in public management agendas. Departmentalism, you're getting a concerted push across OECD countries actually to reduce the number of ministries, and that's something that we're likely to see as being regarded as attractive in an age of economic crisis. The less departments, the cheaper. Rollback of agencyfication, I already discussed that. Re-governmentalisation in some countries, that's why I and all other British citizens now own a big chunk of most of the major British banks. Not something that is going to survive into a period of austerity, I think. That's why we're trying to shift them. But certainly something that we have seen. And we have seen and we are seeing, particularly at local level, many public organisations starting to bring back inside functions that were outsourced and contracted out during the 1980s and 90s, what's sometimes called insourcing. Shared services, something that's talked about a lot, and I think there's probably been more success in Catalonia than there has in the UK, where shared services are promoted and discussed and even paid for in some cases, but not always with great success in terms of actually achieving results from them. But a general sort of reinstating or strengthening of central processes would come under the reintegration theme. What might we see in a second wave? Well, the most important thing here, and really this could appear on any of the next three slides, is the idea of a sort of model that involves an intelligence centre and decentralised delivery. That's the model in the 21st century of most, say, large supermarkets, for example. It's also the reason why a company like Walmart had a much better response and quicker response to Hurricane Katrina in the US than the US federal government. It's basically a model whereby the center of a corporation, or as could be government, relies on intelligent databases updated in real time, which contain massive amounts of transactional data about what people are doing and what they need, and goods and services where they are. That data is used to develop strategy and policy from the center and is immediately accessible to people on the ground, so that decentralized delivery is based on real-time information about people's needs and transactions. That is almost the complete mirror image of most contemporary governments, even in the age of the internet and web-based technologies. That's something to work for in terms of digital era governance, and I'll say more about that at the end. Another element of reintegration that we might see into the future is more integration between tax and benefits systems. Historically, in most countries, we have a long tradition of one massive administrative department dealing with tax and one massive administrative department dealing with benefits. But in an age where both tax and benefits rely on large-scale information systems with which increasingly, although not in all cases, citizens are interacting electronically, there are a lot of arguments for moving those systems closer together. And it is being talked about very seriously in the UK, the possibility of not integrating the systems. That would be virtually impossible, sadly, given the state of those systems. But to start talking about merging the payment systems, so that when people are paid, employers would pass data to would pass data actually via the banks. The government agencies would extract or supplement with the relevant tax and benefits, and the banks would pass out to employees. It's at the early stages now, but it's been talked about in a much more serious way than it has before. That would be reintegration based on a kind of digital era governance model. And finally, sort of joined up governments at the delivery level. That's something we might expect to see in the coming years, if it can be achieved, something that hasn't necessarily happened before. With regard to the second theme, holism, the idea of reorganizing government around the needs of citizens rather than around the needs of organizations. I guess what we have seen here, we've seen it, but perhaps not as much of it as we could have done, because holism initiatives have tended to be expensive. The idea of actually reorganizing government around the needs of citizens is intrinsically a bit of an expensive idea and may not fare well in an age of austerity. But the kind of things, but one-stop shops, ask once processes are the beginning of a sort of intelligence center and decentralized design model, and we have seen some of that and might expect to see more of it in the future. But with regard to holism, I think there's a whole tranche of initiatives that would really make the most of what people are doing with the web, that we might see more of in the future, and that's what this long list is here. The idea that citizen testimonials, the sort of thing that people are very willing to do about restaurants and excuse me, about restaurants and holidays and shops, apply to government also. We have seen the beginning of that in the UK, in terms of in health, for example, sites like patientopinion.com and iwantgreatcare.com, whereby we can to some extent rely on citizens' willingness to provide information about services they have received as a kind of evaluation, even a kind of regulation of public services. Once you enter that territory, you're really getting a model which would involve involves a kind of co-production of public services. We've seen some moves towards that in the UK. For example, the National Health Service have spent, well, actually an extraordinary amount of money on a website called NHS Choices, which does include citizen rankings and evaluations of hospitals as part of the platform. It's not terribly well signposted, and that kind of thing won't go that far without a sort of universal coverage. I mean, it's no good having one or two. It might be okay having one or two restaurant reviews. It's not ideal, but one or two reviews of hospital care is most certainly not ideal. But once you have those facilities, you have the possibility of citizen opinion or testimonials acting as a kind of barometer or thermometer or gauge of the quality of public services. And you might see that kind of initiative working against. We've had a number of quite high profile kind of healthcare disasters in the UK, where a hospital has been plagued by superbugs, for example, and people have been dying as a result. New public management models of public service delivery are very bad at picking up that kind of what is in effect a public services disaster. They're very bad on picking it up, very resistant to public opinion or public comment. A digital era governance kind of model of that hospital, where people kind of hit the web with concern about a given situation or a given hospital or a given area of care, could really perhaps make a difference. Taken to its most extreme, you could see kind of citizen surveillance and citizen scrutiny of government, which you're beginning to see in the US, the UK, Australia, I'm sure here as well, and many other countries, a sort of open book governance model as a replacement for central auditing. And I say that in the UK, the new government have actually are actually closing down the Audit Commission, which is the audit body for local government, and therefore leaving, possibly a gap for citizens to take over. But certainly that's something that's already happened. Whether there will actually be in a move to sort of replace the health and safety executive with restaurant reviews to pick up on sort of cases of bad hygiene or lack of safety. I think most people would regard that as a step too far, but you get my drift. The idea is that citizens start doing some of the audit, evaluation, and even regulatory functions that government used to do. Several things here which we really might expect to see more of in an age of austerity, particularly if central government is sort of backing off functions that it used to do in the name of public service cuts. I guess one of the things perhaps that we might beware of a bit in governments looking for cuts is the development of social web processes within central government. Not all governments are blessed with somebody like Marta, who has embraced social web processes with enthusiasm. And in the UK, there's a lot of cultural resistance within government to taking on sort of social web ideas. It's regarded as something, unnecessary, as an add-on, and also sometimes as something expensive. And that's something which may which may kind of work against the kind of things that I've been talking about. The third theme, digitalization, making the best of digital technologies in government. We've seen things like, we've seen the beginnings of zero-touch technologies, particularly in transport, where no human being touches a transaction, sort of private sector models coming into the public sector. disintermediation, the cutting out of intermediaries, of middlemen in government processes. Most OECD countries have embarked, in fact, almost every country in the world has embarked on some kind of electronic government initiative, some kind of attempt to interact with citizens electronically. What would a second wave of digitalization look like? Well, in various countries we've seen talk of, for example, a government cloud where smaller government agencies can share applications and software. That would be something we might hope to see more of. I have to say, rather disappointingly, in the UK, under the last government, this initiative was talked of enthusiastically in the last policy document of the outgoing government, but only for 2020, I think it was, the year 2020. Quite why we should have to wait till 2020 before having a government cloud is a mystery, and is perhaps sort of it's indicative of the way that governments can be inclined to treat kind of newer web-based technologies in the same way as they've treated older technologies with a sort of big bang approach. Something which they need to break away from. Open data initiatives, Marta was talking about open data. There have been open data initiatives in the UK, the US, Australia again. Many countries freeing up data, opening up data sets for people as well as for developers and social enterprises to make use of. All the data is electronic anyway. It's not so great a step forward to make it available to citizens, although it may be another step to make it useful to citizens. 100% online channel strategies, that's something we might expect to see more of in an age of austerity. Multi-channel approaches, although much talked about during the 1990s, and, are actually extremely expensive. And we might expect to see a move towards 100% online. That's, for example, how even Chile, in the country Chile, in the beginning of the 2000s, managed to achieve a 98% rate for electronic filing of taxes, basically by mandating electronic filing at a time when no other country was doing it. At the same time, they opened up a network of around 3,000 kind of internet tax cafes to facilitate it. It was an idea very much ahead of its time, and was definitely extremely cost effective. But we're definitely likely to see sort of mandated channel reductions, just as in the UK, for example, it's now mandatory, progressively mandatory for businesses to file their taxes online. Those are the key elements of digital era governance. And if I mentioned the difference between the two models as being kind of the reliance on the kind of placing digital technology at the center, that's what digital era governance really means. I think there's another key difference, which is more political, more ideological, which is the way that these two models of government view citizens. The new public management model was very much about government organizations being like business organizations, and involved very narrow lines of accountability. Departments are accountable in a sort of semi-contractual form to central government. Agencies are contractually tied to departments, and then contractors, for example, private companies, tied to agencies, often with real legal contracts, not a quasi-contractual arrangement. In this model, citizens really come in at the bottom and at the top. They come in as voters, and they come in as consumers, consuming public services produced by private contractors. The lines of accountability there are very, very narrow. They go in kind of straight lines. So with digital era governance, we might expect to see a far more, well, a messier model of government, if you like, with far more cross-cutting lines, and where citizens are having much more of a role in processes sort of throughout, even if it is, for example, by, I don't know, commenting on the standard of care that they've received from a hospital. That is a kind of modest form of citizen participation in government, and there are a whole raft of ways that if we see that kind of model developing, we are moving to a stronger model of co-production or even co-creation. Open data at its best can be a kind of co-creation if social enterprises are taking hold of data released by the government and developing applications which are enhancing social welfare. So we're seeing at all levels, if the kind of elements of digital era governance that I've been talking about are pursued, we're seeing at all levels sort of linkages between departments, for example, in terms of shared services, linkages between agency in terms of joined up delivery, joining up at the delivery level, even links between contractors in terms of centralized procurement and electronic procurement. There's all kinds of ways in which we're getting a messier model, but you might argue a more democratic model, a more encompassing, inclusive model. However, that's the kind of theoretical and conceptual perspective, if you like, although based on a range of empirical evidence. We certainly aren't there yet, and if you want one, this is just one graph to illustrate why not. This is the UK Department of Work and Pensions, who in the 1990s invested heavily in the telephone as the primary method of communicating with customers and service delivery. And here are the figures for the percentage of customer interactions that take place on these various channels in 2005 and 2008. So you can see, I mean, in fact, in the between these two periods, the department kind of got rid of a lot of their communications that didn't, as they put it, add value, as they put it rather politely. But so you're seeing a reduction in communications overall. But still, in 2008, and I don't suppose the situation has changed so enormously since then, you can see out of 145 million contacts, annual contacts with citizens, only 340,000, less than 1% of them, took place online. And in this age where, I don't know, I could give you a barrage of statistics now, but in an age where in most countries I think over half the population would probably go to the internet first if they wanted to find anything out, like say the name of their representative or how to take a journey or to catch a train. This is a fairly strange figure. It makes government an outlier, really, in the social and economic world. So still some way to go. And this is a country where internet penetration is considerably higher, I think, than in Spain. It's around 70% and still rising. So that's quite a stark picture. So what might digital era governance, how might it develop further in an age of austerity? Well, I would anticipate three possible scenarios, which I'll say something about in a second. But first of all, I wanted to say what I think should happen. This is those three themes of digital era governance, kind of put together as a Venn diagram, if you like. And I think such a diagram allows us to say something about what would be the best things to pursue enthusiastically, and what would be the things to concentrate on perhaps slightly less. At the center of the diagram and I alluded to this before, is the idea of an intelligent centre and a decentralised delivery. That would mean actually pursuing kind of all the three themes at once. That kind of model rests upon digitalisation, reintegration, and a holistic approach. But overlapping between each of the themes, I think you'll have things which manage to encompass two of those themes, and there would be a more solid basis for digital era governance of the future. The government cloud, for example, would be a form of reintegration because it would involve different departments and agencies using the same standards, the same software, the same applications, but also it would be making the most of digitalization, of making the most of digital technologies. If we come to the idea of a universal benefit, for example, which is something that's been talked about right now at the Conservative Party conference in the UK, you see a sort of reintegrative move, which at the same time is based on the idea of because it's about a universal benefit, but at the same time is based on the idea about what citizens might actually need from a benefit system, rather than an incredibly complex and confusing array of benefits. And incidentally, databases, there are actually 40 personal databases of personal data within the UK central government, with very few links between them. If you think about something like open book government, again, that relies on the digitalization of data and the opening up of data, but it's also data that citizens might want to do something with, data that citizens could actually use to contribute to government and to even kind of co-produce government services. In contrast, I think there are things which are based on only one of these themes, and if not, kind of, if no attempt is made to move towards the centre, we may get some of these elements being pursued beyond their sort of logical usefulness. Take the Open Data Initiative. I mean, I don't want to criticize open data initiatives. You're really not supposed to do that, because basically, of course, it's a good thing opening up data to the public. But there has been some criticism of the Open Data Initiative in the UK, in that it's rather development-led, and I think in Australia also, and even perhaps in the US, that it's developer-led, that it's data that's been opened up for people, for either enterprises to make money out of, or developers to do clever things with. It's not necessarily data that's been opened up because citizens really want it or know what to do with it. And if you aren't thinking about some kind of reintegrative initiative or some kind of holistic initiative that is geared at what citizens actually need, there's a danger that data will be opened up for perhaps no overall purpose. It doesn't do any harm, of course, to have data sitting there, but there is a danger perhaps that while the big push towards open data is on, these data sets will be updated and presented in a useful way, but over time they will become outdated and will actually in the end give misleading information. It needs to be brought into a model of public management reform rather than exist as a solo initiative. Again, with departmentalism, if you create I don't know, an enormous department like the Department of Homeland Security in the US, which really is a mega department created out of a number of departments and agencies that were there before, but don't start thinking about what it's actually doing with respect to citizens, then you end up with a kind of department that has just as many, a huge mega department that has just as many silos in it as it did before it was reintegrated. It needs some kind of again, some kind of intelligence center. It needs some kind of joining up of information systems, digitalization initiatives before it can really be regarded as part of a digital era governance model. So what were the three scenarios I suggested for the future? Well, one of them is a kind of political replay of new public management. This would be a scenario where governments like the new government in the UK said new public management, that's the way to go. Let's start breaking up central government. We'll go for a lean, mean state. That's how people used to talk of new public management, ending up with a sort of shrinking state, even a withered state, if you like. That would mean a crisis for digital era governance. It would mean render it kind of impossible to make the most of digital technologies. It would be the kind of opposite of an intelligence center and decentralized delivery design. Are we likely to see that? Well, everything I've argued, everything I've sort of put to you is really on the basis of arguing no. We're not likely to see that. But I guess there is also a danger that it could happen in some areas of government, but perhaps particularly at the local level. We are seeing, and I'm sure quite probably you are here too, we're seeing raft of cuts spreading across local governments in the UK, and at least 4 or 5 councils have been badged kind of easy councils on the kind of Ryanair model, where the council isn't a Ryanair or EasyJet model, whereby the council in its most extreme, will just consist of a few people to sign the contracts, and all public services will be delivered by, it seems, either private sector organisations or groups of enthusiastic volunteering citizens forming part of the big society. To many people that seems, I mean, it's difficult to imagine how kind of volunteers are going to start collecting the rubbish. You know, in many ways this seems like a bit of a joke, but it is something which is being labelled by some councils as the strategic council, the virtual council even. I can't remember if that's Suffolk or Brighton, but what to me is worrying about these kind of, well, one thing that's worrying, as some commentators have pointed out, is it's like taking a step back 20 years. This is the kind of thing that was talked about in the 1980s. This was the dream of the Conservative government of the time in the UK, was a council run by a handful of people. That's one thing. But the other thing is that although the word virtual is used, and strategic, it's very you see very little allusion to the web, the social web, the internet, or digital technologies. It's kind of virtual without what many of us would have come to believe is meant by the word virtual. So it's a worrying scenario, and it's something that we have to accept is still there on the table. Another possible scenario is a sort of investment pause. Indeed, again in the UK, we have seen a kind of moratorium on large-scale government IT projects. Even projects over $1 million have to undergo some sort of serious review, and there is basically no talk of projects over 100 million. This is partly a sort of path dependency from the UK's own experience with information technology. The government, the UK government has had particularly bad experiences with large-scale IT projects. And in the days when I used to teach on a master's degree in public policy to many postgraduate students from overseas at UCL, when they arrived, when I talked about this subject, I used to say to them, if you're specially interested in information technology disasters, you have so come to the right country. We are number one. And that has had an effect on the way that government in particular, because the most public of these disasters have been in government, the way that government officials approach any kind of sort of technological innovation. Ironically, that applies to the much cheaper web-based initiatives of the kind that I've been talking about. And it could be that we'll see, if this scenario were to be emerged, we would see it reinforced by public officials. I mean, it really isn't regarded as a good career move within the UK civil service to say, oh, I'll take charge of that information technology project, you know, I'll be the project manager. That's seen as some kind of career suicide. So you can see that such a scenario could be reinforced by kind of attitudes within the government. And a sort of receding away. That could be quite a worrying scenario, even in 3 to 5 years. I've already shown you that in many ways the UK government lags behind the private sector in terms of what it's doing with web-based technologies. And in that scenario, we could see that lag getting even greater. Government faces far more competition for visibility in the internet world, and we could see a sort of declining visibility of government, or a sort of weakening of government, even if it's only a kind of pause in investment rather than some kind of ideological shift to a different model of government. So there are worries about that scenario, that only the sort of cheapest, only the market-led elements of digital era governance that I've talked about would survive, and that would lead to a sort of unbalanced digital era governance model where the kind of cheap solo theme elements succeed and the others are rejected. And finally, the other scenario is kind of an expansion of digital era governance, kind of all online strategies, which really do kind of run down other channels where government sort of becomes its electronic presence. And what I've called balanced digital era governance model survives. That's the one I'd recommend. And I'll stop there.